budgeting and spending. And there's really not like a thou shalt budget in the New Testament. There's really not even an Old Testament direct one-to-one principle here. But what we do have is a lot of biblical principles. We've talked about some of them already with stewardship and faithfulness. And we're going to talk some more today about like contentedness and some things like that. That's going to help us form a good theology of spending and budgeting. So if you're looking again for some sort of prescription on like this is how you should spend and this is how you should budget and like the mechanics of balancing a checkbook, this isn't going to be the class that you're going to get today. We're going to still talk broadly about these things. Your handout does have some advice in it. There are some principles on the back that we'll talk about. Some of them are biblically based. Some of them are just practical, like this is things that do work. So we're going to get a little bit of both and. We're going to get some biblical principles, and we're also going to get some practical application. So we're going to do a little bit of both today. So let me pray, and then we'll get started. Gracious God, thank you for today. Thank you for this opportunity to look into your word. Help us to understand what it does say about how we should spend our money and what we should do and can do for your glory, Lord. And we ask this now in Christ's name. Amen. So let me ask you guys then. Let's pick up where we're at. Okay, so we're in our second week of money. We've dealt with generosity and giving. We're going to talk a little bit about spending and budgeting today. We got 2 more sessions, one on saving and one on materialism. And then we're going to get into how you can steward other things, time, health, skills, and then what keeps us from being good stewards. So let's talk about spending then. So let me ask you guys, how does the gospel change the way that you view your money? Does it? Can it? Yeah, there's the gospel automatically assumes that there's something outside of ourselves, right? It's not all about us, it's not us focused, it's not us centered. So if there's this inherent otherness in the gospel that God has to reach down and do these things for us because we can't do it ourselves, then that does stand to reason that all of this money, like we learned in the first lesson on stewardship, is God's money that he's given us to do something with. Jeff?
Church, that has eternal value. And to me, I invest in the stock market, but that's not going to keep people safe.
Yeah, there's a focus now too, right? If the gospel really has regenerated us, if the work of the Holy Spirit in your heart to do that where you can now make decisions that are both pleasing to God and have lasting eternal value, then that should impact how we spend our money. Not that we don't spend our money on food and clothes, and we're going to talk about lifestyle here in a minute, but it does then make us realize that this house, this car, this whatever is temporary, that this isn't what it's all about. Anything else? Okay, so then reach way back, think about 4 weeks ago, when we were talking about stewardship. How can that principle of stewardship, and Kevin touched on it briefly, help us with how we need to spend our money, how we can spend our money, how we should spend our money? What does that stewardship principle teach us then?
We have the verse that, if any man doesn't take care of his own household, then he's worse than an infidel. So we have to make sure, I guess, that we got to make sure we have food on the table and
Yeah.
Well, we need to make sure that we're planning for that, we're ready for being able to help with those kinds of needs.
Yeah, so the stewardship parable we looked at was a stewardship parable about what? Money. it was an easy thing to understand because it's an easy thing to understand. We have money, we're supposed to do stuff with it. There's an expectation that we do some things with it. So we're going to look at some of those expectations to be that good and faithful steward. So then what about faithfulness? Remember, we made the argument in week 2 that faithfulness is part of stewardship too, that believing God is who he says he is, he will do the things he says he does. how does that help us make decisions about how to spend our money? Should it help us make decisions on how we spend our money? Or maybe think about how to budget our money. Well, what about this? If Christ says that you don't have to worry about the clothes on your back, the food you're going to eat tomorrow, if Christ says, look at the birds and the flowers and tell me that there's something that's earthly more beautiful than that, if he says not to worry about it, then should we really worry about it?
I mean, I think it's easy, and some people could use all this on my couch, but
Yeah.
the Old Testament say, you need to get off your whatever.
Right, learn from the ant.
And
Yeah.
go, and they were supposed to leave the corner of their fields. They had to physically get up and do something.
Right.
What was there for them to do? He didn't say, I'm just gonna come and knock on your door and hand you another house.
Yeah, that's the whole point of faith, right? James talks about that in James 1. How do I know that you have faith? Well, I can see you doing things that demonstrate it. So when we talk about finances, yes, we've been told not to worry about finances, but yet we've also been told to be a good steward of our finances. So it's not like I'm out here just racking up debt and blowing money away because it's all temporary and it doesn't matter anyway. It's that I am still being that good, faithful person. I'm still doing that. I'm still exercising judicious judgment when I make these choices. But I'm also going to realize that there are things that are more consequential value. Like I understand what I make and how I provide for my family is important. But I'm also going to realize that jobs change. I can get hit by a bus tomorrow. If I quit my job or get fired from my job, I'm going to get replaced. You know, the point is that it's the where your heart is. Is my heart in this money, in this place, in this thing, or is my heart in things that are more eternal? So we've talked about faithfulness, we've talked about stewardship. We've seen that the gospel can and does impact this. You guys summed it up pretty good. So you're looking at everything you have belongs to God. And this is more than just money, but I think money is a good way to stop and think about it because it's probably the thing that's most evident to us, but we can't leave it there. We can't just think about money in isolation from the rest of what God has asked us to do. And that's what about stewardship is. So we've been called to give an account one day for this, so we have to act as if we're going to. We should have a goal in our stewardship. That's to make the most of what we have, not for our own glory, but for God's glory. And then here's an interesting thought too. This is talking about hoarding is spiritually dangerous. And we've made mention of a couple different times of the parable where Christ says you can't serve two masters, you can't serve both money and God. And the point there is what? It's a heart attitude. You know, you can't invest all your time and energy and effort into something both earthly and something both spiritual. You're either working towards spiritual ends or you're working towards physical ends. So what Jesus is saying here is that your energy and effort has to be directed at something more than this. So we've talked about giving last week, which is a good way to serve God. We're going to talk about spending this week, which can also be a good way to serve God. And that's the last point. We talked about this in stewardship. We talked about this in faithfulness. We talked about this in spending. It's that the idea that what we're doing is actually bringing glory to God. So it's not that we can't spend it on ourselves because God says, take care of yourselves, take care of your family. It's just that where's that line between me thinking about me and me thinking about God? You know, so I'll give you a really selfish example of this. Like I only wear a tie when I teach because I don't have any other opportunities to wear ties. Okay, I teach roughly once a quarter. So a fourth of the year I'm teaching. Do I have an adequate number of ties to cover my teaching Sundays? Yes, I absolutely do. What do I spend the majority of my Kohl's cash on though? New ties. You know, so again, a completely ridiculous, minuscule example. But again, like, well, I'm teaching Sunday school. Like this tie is for the glory of God, right? Is it though? Is it? I submit that it may not be. So, thinking about that idea of the purposefulness behind what you're spending on. Is this for me? Is this meeting a legitimate need that I have? Or is this something that's for God. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about the rest of this time when we look at budgeting, when we look at how a community of believers can help us do this, and then look at some basic principles. So, first up, we reviewed stewardship. So how much? How much do we spend? We'll listen to this in Proverbs. 2 things I ask of you. Deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying, and give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. So what's this proverb teach us about how much we should spend and how much we should want? Or conversely, how we should budget?
I heard this morning that a guy that owns Hobby Lobby reversed himself from it, and it was just interesting because he commented on how riches generally really mess up a family. I just found that interesting and wise as this proverb is that having a whole lot of money generally isn't a good thing. People don't use it wisely.
Yeah, so this definitely saying keep me from excess and keep me from not having enough. What else is it telling us? Is there a dollar amount attached to this proverb? No, there really isn't. It says, really, that I just want enough. So help me out. How much is enough? You know, is it Rockefeller $1 more? Or is it enough to keep us from being poor and stealing, but not enough that we would trust in our own devices and say, look at all this stuff that I've done? And this is the hard part, right? Because this is a proverb. This is an axiomatic truth, something that is largely applicable and largely found to be true to the human experience. And looking at the human experience, we are being asked to be satisfied with just enough to meet our own needs. So let me ask you, what's a need? What do you actually need? You know, and you can get all like Maslow hierarchy on me, but like what's some needs that you have in life that should be met monetarily?
Shelter.
Yeah, like we got to live somewhere, whether it's renting or whether it's a house that you've bought and now you have a mortgage. There's a requirement to like live somewhere. What else?
For me, I feel like just as a family, have a house, my big need is to make sure my kids and my wife have food and they have a place to live.
Yeah. Yeah, if we've got a family, we got to provide for that family. Like my kids eat a lot, frequently. You know, why? But they do. Like I have a wife. Like I have to provide for her needs too. You know, we're single income, so like that is, like it's me, it's my job to do that. So like my family has other physical needs. What else? What else is a need?
Good health.
Yeah, like you can't do this stuff if you're not healthy. Now, like we can talk about the healthcare system in America and how broken it is, but let's not. Let's just assume that you have to pay money to stay healthy because you kind of do. So yeah, so we're gonna have to carry insurance and we're gonna have to do all that preventative stuff. And when we do get sick, we're gonna need acute care. And then maybe like something terrible happens and then you're gonna need post-acute care, or maybe you're going to end up in an assisted living facility at some point in time in your life. Like we have to maintain our health, and that costs a lot of money.
So do we need to try and gym them? I'm not gonna
Yeah, maybe, right? Because here's the question. That might be what you need to stay healthy. So who am I to look at your gym membership and be like, well, you live on a street, you can run on the street. You don't need to go run on a treadmill. Like it gets too cold outside, I stop running outside. Like now, I stopped running outside. Because now it's like, it's warm now, but it was cold, like it snowed last Monday. Like as soon as it snows, I'm done. Like I'm not running outside, this is ridiculous. But maybe to maintain your health, that gym membership might be a necessity. Maybe it's not. Noose, what else?
You know, one of the things that we're missing in all of this is that in the past, we had none of these structures in place that we're talking about. now.
Yeah.
We had family that took care of one another and met each other's needs as God would
So what we're really talking about is a lifestyle. And there's kind of variations of lifestyles, right? Maybe it's a multi-generational family that lives together or in close proximity to one another. Like, look, I'm from West Virginia. My entire family lived in the same zip code. You know, like I could see houses from the other house. You know, when my dad's parents, you know, got sick, my dad's brother moved in with them. You know, like this is a concept that's not foreign to a lot of us. But that multi-generational, that reliance on each other, that close-knit family, that's a lifestyle choice. I am not close to my family right now. I'm 10 hours away. I'm an only child. So like, now my parents are still relatively healthy, but like, who's gonna take care of my parents? Golden Living's gonna take care of my parents. No, like I still have a responsibility to take care of my parents. But my lifestyle choice is to be here in Wisconsin instead of in West Virginia with my parents. Other lifestyle choices are where you live, what job you have. So as we start talking about how much is enough, enough is gonna be dictated by our lifestyle. Now, let's stop and talk about that for a minute, because what does the Bible say about lifestyle choices? Okay, now maybe there's a couple more things that we can talk about. Now maybe there's a little bit more to consider. How much do I need? Because it's what lifestyle has God called me to? So when I'm talking about lifestyle, I'm talking about the spending habits you've become accustomed to. And a lot of our needs are the result of that. So if God calls us to a life, a certain lifestyle, will not God then provide for that? So when we talk about the call of God, we typically talk about what? Like full-time ministers and missionaries, right? Like God has called you to a life of service. God calls us all to salvation, right? Make your calling and election sure, Paul says. So all of you have been called to something in your life. So if God has called you to this, then God will provide for it. So again, how much is enough? Well, it's going to look different for you than it's going to look for me. I got 3 kids under the age of 10. It looks different for me than empty nesters. It looks different for me than the family with 1 teenager. It looks different for me to the family with no kids. It looks different to the single person who doesn't have a family, regardless of age. So when we're talking about how much is enough, really, I can't tell you that necessarily. What I can tell you is that there are some more biblical principles to consider, such as 1 Timothy 6:17. For as much as the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. So what does this tell us about enough? Does it help us in our understanding of it? I think it does, because it's telling us what? Enough could be a lot. Timothy doesn't say, Paul doesn't tell Timothy, like, hey, you can't have rich people in the church. Like, if you're a Christian, you got to be poor, man. This is saying that there's rich people in the church, like, who have more than enough.
I think once you have the amount of riches where you start to not depend on God for anything, you just live your life.
Mm-hmm.
That's, it gets to the point, like, it's being, or not having enough helps you grow spiritually because you have to depend on God.
Right.
Like, if you can't pay this or that, like, you're gonna have to pray and seek help from God. But once you get to that point where you feel like you don't need God, then I think that might be a little too much.
Yeah, so there's certainly a danger in it, and that's what Paul's saying, is like, look, these people that have enough can rely on themselves and not God. But yet he's also telling us God has provided us richly, so he's given us more than enough of things to enjoy. So there is maybe an upper limit on this, but I don't think that upper limit's a dollar sign.
From Ecclesiastes, the preacher says that, I see it's good when a man is able to enjoy the fruit of his labor.
Mhm.
The fruit of your labor is, more than enough. The idea is it's okay to be
Yeah, this is telling us that God has given us these things to enjoy. So guess what? That means you can spend some money on stuff that you enjoy, like tithes. What's up?
Isn't this indeed a chance to glorify God and say, thanks, I've got this stuff? I mean, if it's too much, you can say, Lord, thanks, help me be wise in where I give my.
Yeah.
I think he can be glorified through this, just if we have more than others, it doesn't mean we're not.
Yeah, and we talked about that last week with giving. Like, again, the purpose of giving is to not give back to God, but to be a wise steward of what God has already given you, because it's His anyway. So I think that this is kind of talking about the two dangers we need to think about, and that's that lifestyle determines needs can't exceed our income. So again, if I am called to a certain life, you've been called to be a healthcare safety professional, okay? I make what I make, I have the job I have, it provides for my family. My needs shouldn't exceed what I'm doing. You've been called to whatever it is that you're doing. Your needs shouldn't exceed whatever it is you've been called to. So do you need a house? Yes. What kind of house? Depends on your lifestyle. Do you need a car? Yeah. Depends on your lifestyle. Do you need 2 cars? Depends on your lifestyle. But again, if you've been called to a need, your need can't exceed that. So you have to then be wise in how you spend. We needed a second car. It's just the reality of the situation. I work in Madison, Lisa lives in Watertown, we have kids, they gotta go places, gotta do things. Did I go out and buy a brand new car off a lot? I absolutely did not. I set a very low dollar amount that I was looking for and found a car inside of that price range. We paid the first car off and then took the amount that was that car payment and said that's what we can probably afford for the next car payment, and we shopped accordingly. And we found something with reasonable gas mileage that, the transmission went out of. But that's beside the point, okay? We had savings, we paid for it out of savings, and there it was. But it's not like I just went out. I needed a second car. I did not need an S55. I mean, I would love to have, but beside the point, okay? I just needed a second car that I could reliably commute with, and that's what I got. So the second car was a necessity, but again, did I exceed that need by getting something that was outside of my price range? I did not. So then the other thing to consider then is our needs will rise in parallel with our income, our perceived needs, right? Think about it like this. I'm not a lawyer, I don't work with lawyers. Actually, I do work with a lawyer, okay? You work at a law firm. Like that's there's an expectation, especially like white shoe lawyers will make white shoe lawyer money, and you have to drive all the same cars and do all the same things and that's a perceived rise in need. But is it? Again, if you go back to our principle that needs and lifestyle and excesses, well, yeah, you've been given a certain amount of money to live off of, so that's what you live off of. You don't live off of that money in light of what you can make. Think about people that are in tiered salary structures or that work off a commission. Are you banking off tomorrow's profits? I think there's a verse in James that says something about that, right? It says you're supposed to hope that you make that, but really, you don't know. You have to trust in God to do that. So when we're thinking about this idea of needs and lifestyles, we really need to think about what needs are, but realize that those needs can kind of be subjective. So how can we make good lifestyle choices? A couple of verses. Here's a verse in 1 Timothy. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So how can we pick good lifestyles? What is some decisions that can help us make good lifestyle choices? What's Timothy telling us here? How can this verse help us make a good lifestyle choice? Yeah, right? Like if I know that I have to have food, clothing, housing, then let's pick a lifestyle that's going to provide decent food, clothing, housing, enough food, clothing, and housing for me to support my family or my not family or me as a single person. Start with enough. What else can this help us make a good lifestyle choice with?
It addresses the love of money. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
isn't bad.
Right,
Loving money is very good.
right.
Bad part.
So it's another focus thing, yeah? So I'm going to focus on God and His glory, and if money happens to come along with that, then great. I'm not going to flip-flop the two. I'm not just going to chase money because I have perceived needs. I'm not just going to chase money because I think it will solve all of my problems. Man, if I had like 10 extra grand a month, that would solve all of my problems. Would it though? Because what are your problems? Are they like legit dollars and cents problems? Some of them, maybe, yeah. But if we talk about choosing lifestyle problems, maybe part of it is a focus issue. Are we focused on God or are we focused on the money? Anything else? All right, so I want to hold on to those verses because we're going to jump ahead. So let's look at some of these then. It's in your handout. It's on the back or inside? I think it's inside. Let's look at some verses on how to choose a lifestyle. So we should have a goal to use every gift, every opportunity, every relationship, every dollar we have to proclaim the glory of God with every minute that He gives us on this earth. So lifestyle is often defined by a few big decisions. So where do you live? What kind of job that you have? Do you marry? Do you have kids? Those are all decisions that will affect your lifestyle. So you make those decisions prayerfully. You make them in consultation with other wise believers. You make those decisions between you and God. Because guess what? I can't tell you who to marry. I can't tell you what job to have. I can't tell you where to live. That's a decision that's made between you and God. You know, if we want to have the whole big will of God discussion, we can have that discussion. But really, that's a decision between you and God. Think about this too. Time and money are interchangeable, and to a degree, so are relationships in time and money. So think about it like this. Do you want to spend more time making more money, or do you want to spend more time with your family? Do you want to spend more time doing something that brings God glory, or do you want to spend more time at work? Do you want to spend more time enjoying something God has already given you? Or do you want to spend more time and money on something that you don't have? So think about it. It asks us to consider relationships in there too. I mean, you can do that same thing. Do you want to spend more time with relationships than you do making money? But think about that for a minute. Where is your priority? And be flexible. That's the passage in James, right? If we can go to such and such a city, and if God allows, we'll do these certain things. So make flexible plans in your lifestyle choices. Maybe you're in a double income family. Think about what it would look like to be on a single income. Maybe budget for a single income, live off a single income, and spend the rest on godly pursuits. Or maybe take a job that pays less so you can spend more time. Again, choices that you can make. Keep a long view in mind, all right? This isn't about the next paycheck, the next quarter, the next whatever. We're working for eternal results. So if we're working eternally, then we have to make decisions in light of eternity. So what's going to have more lasting impact? My quarterly sales results or what I've done with some of that time and money in the church and missions in my family? Consider that. And then consider the weaker brother. What are other people in the church going to think about this? We're going to talk about community here in a minute, but community can help us make some of these decisions. Should we be flaunting our wealth in the church? I'm pretty sure there's some verses about that. So do consider your lifestyle choices with how it looks to other believers. And then think about something that might be unique or different. So maybe think about missions. Think about full-time ministry. Think about volunteering at Christian camp. Think about those opportunities as opportunities to be a better steward, not just the financial impacts of, I got to take 2 weeks of PTO to go do this. So consider some of those things in the light of eternity. So how do you choose a lifestyle? I don't know, maybe God speaks supernaturally to you and tells John the Baptist to go out and live in the desert and eat grasshoppers. Or maybe not. We should pray for wisdom. We should get the counsel of others. We should use good sense to seek his kingdom first. So do you have kids? What job do you have? Where do you work? Where do you live? God will provide for us richly for our enjoyment. But we have to think about that light of eternity and not just our next paycheck. So that's kind of the spiritual side of things. Let's stop here for a minute. Any questions, comments, concerns about some of the biblical foundations we've laid? Because it's going to get kind of practical for the next couple minutes. And this is where we can actually have good Christianly debate. But we've laid some foundation. Do we need to do any tuck pointing, do some chinking with that, or are we all good? All right. No, go ahead, Noose.
Yes, since we're on this subject, what is the, well, this church and just the church in general, you know, we're talking about community here. And
Yeah.
for example, there are folks out there, especially in these times, pretty difficult with inflation and everything else. There's some people out there, because of what circumstances, where do we stand? How do we come along with individuals as far as them, for example, taking out, I know the government being the government right now, and it's been going on for 50, 60 years as far as the handouts that are given out. At what point, you know, do we, for example, family has a young family, the husband who's the primary financial giver, goes out on food stamps and, you know, and even housing and things of that nature. How do we interpret that in this day and age versus in the past?
Yeah, I don't know that our church as an organization has a standpoint on that. I have some opinions about it. Let me talk through some of the mechanics of the budget because it might help answer some of those questions, and then we'll make sure that we come back to that because those are good thoughts. But let me see if I can draw this conversation out a little bit, and then maybe if there's time, I'll share my personal opinion about it. But again, as a church, I don't think we necessarily have a stance on it. As a church, though, we do have a benevolent fund. Like, we do realize that we have a role, those who have a role to play with those that do have not, or have as much. So I don't think that that's necessarily violating a biblical principle. So how government does it and how things like that, we can talk about that. But let's talk about how we can make some of those smart decisions, how we can plan for some of that as much as we can plan for it, and see if we can maybe answer one or two of those questions as we go on. Does that make sense? I'm not kicking the can down the road, but I'm like slightly pushing it aside. So, okay, thanks, News. All right, so let's think about then. So how do we actually try to be a good steward of what we have? Well, we can do it with budgeting. So why budget, how to budget? Okay, look, this isn't a Dave Ramsey class. I'm not going to give you all the nuts and bolts of how to do it and why to do it. But let's just talk a couple minutes then about what a budget is and how it can help us do some of this. Because it's really just a tool. It's something to make sure that your checks don't bounce. That's short-sightedness, though. If all you're trying to do is control money in and money out and track it, then you're kind of missing the point of what we're doing. Okay, because we've backed this whole conversation up to say that we're trying to be good, faithful stewards of what God has given us. So a budget is a communication tool. A budget is a tool then that we can use to push us into those right decisions, those decisions that we've said, these are things that matter for eternity, these are things that matter for God. This is what we need to do. So I think it will do two things. It will help communicate our goals and intentions, and then it will help us be content with what we have. So, how is it a tool for contentedness? Well, it might help you restrain overspending. And this is the most simplistic sense of a budget, right? I have $100 to do this with, so when that $100 is gone, it's over. Okay, real low-level sensible stuff, okay? It might prevent you from guilt or anxiety when you do spend money. Okay, because that's the ditch on the other side of the road, right? Oh, I can't spend money. That'd be ungodly. Oh, I can't do. Well, you know what? We have to spend money. Things cost money. You know, it really is kind of terrible to stop and think about some of the things we spend money on, and that's a tool for the budget to be like, yes, I had a line item for our dog. We budget. Our dog's a line item in our budget. Okay? Like, I love our dog. It's a family pet. But guess what? It costs food. It has to go to the vet. There's things, I got to license it in the city of Watertown. Like, our dog's a line item in our budget. Okay? We love her, and she's part of our family, but she's a budget line item. Okay? Because it's just things cost money. So you do have to spend money. The budget can also then help you show how God has already provided for you. So you think about like our car payment. Okay, God provides enough for us to have this car payment at this amount a month. But now I need to put a new solenoid in the transmission. Okay, God has faithfully provided up to this point. God will continue to faithfully provide in the future. Contentedness. And then it makes sure that your spending is based on what you need rather than with your income. Because if you've prepared a budget ahead of time, you've said, this is roughly what we're going to need to spend on this, 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 and this. Oh, hey, I took a 5.5% raise this year. Okay, great. You budgeted on current amount of money minus 5.5%. So you don't need to figure out, like, ooh, what am I going to do with all this extra money now? Well, because we've talked about other things that you can do with it. If you've budgeted down here, then you're going to keep your spending independent from your income. So if your income fluctuates, your spending is what your spending is. Maybe you get paid by the commission. Maybe you make a 2.5% commission this year or this quarter, but that drops to 1.5% next quarter. You know, maybe you've got some sort of bonus structure built into your job. Okay, yeah, that's great. Guess what? That's going to fluctuate. You know, maybe your income's solely based off stock market returns. I don't know if that's true for anybody here, but maybe it is. Guess what? That's going to fluctuate over time. So it should be a helpful way to keep you from doing that. It can then also be a great tool for communication. So now, when you're putting your budget together, you're being proactive, not reactive. You're being strategic rather than just being driven by constraints. So you can then figure out, like, how much you can spend on certain things. You can sit down with your significant other and have a conversation about what this would look like. It's not just all of a sudden, hey, I bought this dumb thing, and then you're told, you bought what dumb thing? You know, it's a communication tool to have those proactive conversations rather than a reactive conversation. And then it can help you prevent some of this ungodly judging in the sense that, where are your priorities? Look, if the budget for the groceries is the budget for the groceries, and maybe it's weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever it is, and you accidentally buy the name brand peanut butter, oh no. Is it still in the budget? Great. You know, maybe I bought frozen instead of fresh. All right, that's fine. Is it in the budget? Okay, we don't need to pull all those little conversations out and be like, you could be so much more godly if you saved that 72 cents. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the glory of God. You have a budget for food because you have to eat. The bigger question is that budget inside of your means? So we've got a couple of minutes, so let's flip to the back then and talk about some of those ways to actually manage a budget. This came with the curriculum. This is something that I thought was helpful, so I included it. I'm not the content creator, and I'm not the subject matter expert on this. I've at least read through this and have my own thoughts, so I'll share them with you, and then we can wrap this up with the idea of community in the last couple of minutes. So, you've built your budget. What do you do with it? Maybe budget your savings like you budget your spending. Make sure every dollar you have has a purpose, and to the best of your ability, determine how much you need to save. We did this with the church budget, right? we completely reorganized our church budget under our guiding principles. So like, this is what the church is spending on evangelism. This is what the church is spending on missions. This is what the church is spending on fellowship, because we said that that was a core part of who we are. So we racked and stacked our budget under all those things. We have designated funds, because we're legally mandated to as a nonprofit, that says this is what money does. This money's for the missions trip. This money's for this, for that. It's not just straight cash money that we're going to distribute amongst ourselves and our shareholders, because we don't have any. We're a nonprofit. This money has a purpose. Maybe we should do the same thing with our own budgets. Like, what part of my budget is for fellowship? What part of my budget is for Christian education? What part of my budget is for missions? And maybe that's part of what your spending budget is. Maybe that's part of what your savings budget is. I'm saving for a missions trip. I'm saving to be able to support a need that I know is out there. So we do this inside our church already. Maybe we should do it inside of our homes already. So that goes closely with give every dollar in your budget a biblical job description. Can you identify from Scripture what this is? How is this part of your discipleship? Now, wait a minute. You just said like 40 minutes ago that you could spend money on yourself frivolously. Not frivolously, but I did say you could spend money on yourself. Where is that in the biblical job description? How do I jive having a biblical purpose with all this stuff with also being able to like enjoy things, like take vacations and buy boats and do things that are for my enjoyment? How do I mesh those two things together? Does anybody remember? Maybe there was a verse about it? Yeah, we've been given these things for our enjoyment. And we can find that enjoyment, yes, through the spiritual purposes that God has given them, to bring Him glory, to build up the brethren, to do things like that. But everything that God has richly given us has been part of our contentment. So maybe you've got a little bit more to be content with than maybe somebody else does. But yeah, you can spend money on yourself. Not telling you how much, not telling you what percentage of the budget it needs to be. Because again, we talked about lifestyle choices. So if you've made the right, proper, God-honoring lifestyle choices, you will then make the right, proper, God-honoring enjoyment decisions too. And again, I can't tell you what that's going to specifically look like for you. But I think that we can do it. So then think about excess in your budget. Should it go to giving or should it go to savings? Think about it. Think about your day-to-day decisions. They're not so much spend, save, but maybe they're spend, give. We spent a whole last week talking about giving and the necessity of it and how we can do it. So maybe that should be the decision. Not saying that we shouldn't save some, but thinking about the temporalness of this world and our money and our stuff, maybe part of that decision should be giving and not necessarily saving. Maybe you're married. Think about living off one income. It's a possibility, right? Sickness, work situations, stuff could change. If you've got two incomes, think about maybe what it would be like to live off of one income or two lesser incomes. It's just a consideration to think about. Include a line for generosity in your budget. Be purposeful about how much you give. That was all of last week's lesson. I'm not going to reteach it. And then maybe talk through your budget with a Christian friend. Oh man, everyone just got super nervous, right? Because what are the two things you're not supposed to talk about? Well, there's a couple of things, but money's almost always one of them, right? I can't tell people how much money I make and how much money I spend. Why not? So let's think about what part of a community role can play. So think about these two verses in Matthew. Matthew says, judge not, Christ says it in Matthew, that you be not judged. And beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. So these are two very common biblical injunctions we see about this kind of public practice of how you react to your brothers and sisters. And more often than not, we're talking about this usually in a negative sense, right? Like we point at the Pharisees and be like, see, look at these judging Pharisees being judges and all judgy. And look how hypocrisy they were. They were the ones that were doing all this stuff. So Christ is saying, don't be a Pharisee. Okay, yeah, that's an immediate application of what this was talking about, but there's an application here for me and you today, too. So we can have a conversation as a church about how we spend our money and make it a normal part of our life. We've talked about being transparent with sin, right? Confess your sins one to another. We've talked about being transparent with each other, having life groups, so that you can have some iron sharpening iron. We've talked about how we should be invested in the discipling culture in each other's lives so that we can help each other become more conformed to the image of Christ. So why wouldn't we talk about money? Right? Look, if we're talking about sin, then we can talk about money. So maybe part of that community then is to have that conversation, not in a judging way, not in a way that you would elevate yourself over your brother to be like, I clearly have this figured out and you do not. But in a way that you can come alongside and say, yeah, hey man, I've been there. I've had 2 car payments. Or, yeah, I remember when that happened to me too. Or, hey, that's how much money I make. Let's have a conversation about this. We're more alike than we thought. You and your fancy ties. You make the same amount of money I do. You know, we can have that conversation as a community. Why would we be transparent about everything else except that? Especially when we've been saying, there's a lot of teaching in there about money. So that first danger is judging. You can't make that quick judgment about the financial decisions of others. You know, we're self-centered to think about it that we would have our own reasoning to do it. Well, that's not the decision I would have made because I'm so much smarter and more financially literate and so much more spiritual. Maybe that person grew up in a family that didn't do that or had a different priority, and it's something that they've brought with them into their marriage. Maybe they've just never heard that there's an opportunity to do something differently. So that's the judge that we become in our hearts. So when we have financial conversations as brothers and sisters in Christ, don't assume motivation. When someone does something you don't understand, don't presume why they did it. And when you do speak to someone about their financial decisions, make sure that your motivation is one of compassion. You can't say, how dare they do that? Galatians 6:1 says that if someone's caught in a sin, we should restore them gently. So again, if we're talking about sin in another person's life and we're trying to bring them along gently, we're not going to go to them and be like, how dare you do these things? We're going to say, I've been there too. We're going to say, I struggle with that too. We're going to say, this is what's helped me overcome this. We're going to pick that person up. We're not going to push them back down. So from a positive perspective, I think if we put all of these things together as our life like a church, we can talk about financial decisions. There's no reason why we can't be specific in our encouragement and exhortation, and at the same time, still focus on the grace of God. Yes, God has richly provided for you, has richly provided for me. God is doing a thing in your life. God's done a thing in my life. Because that's the conversation we're having. We're having it about God, not our finances. We're having a conversation about God and His glory, not about, yes, it's about the decisions that we make, but why? So, I think there's a worthiness in having a conversation as a church family about this. And I would encourage you to maybe start having some of those conversations. I think life group's a great way to do it. You're already in a small group setting of people that you trust or in similar life circumstances as you are, so maybe that's great. Maybe you've got 1 or 2 families in this church or 1 or 2 friends in this church that you're known for a long time and you're comfortable having those more intimate conversations with. I encourage you to start thinking about some of that conversation and including finances in it. It's going to be awkward at first, I know. But I think there's a worth to it. Because how can we make some of these biblical decisions where there's not a clear thou shalt or thou shalt not without seeking some godly counsel? And how can you seek that godly counsel without actually talking about the money? I think you have to. So I've shared some very basic practical things. There's probably other people in this church that have infinitely better opinions. But you won't know that until you search them out. So let me pray, and then we'll have a couple minutes to talk amongst ourselves, and maybe you can do that. Gracious God, thank you for today. Thanks for this opportunity to consider how to spend